Lisa. We're doing the respiratory system, and now we're going to talk about how the process of breathing, the control of ventilation, is controlled by the neural system. Okay, so neural control of breathing. So, so there's no auto-arrhythmic pacemaker cells. So it's not like the heart exactly. So the thing is we don't super know the exact mechanism for the respiratory rhythm. Okay, we know a few things about it, so we're going to kind of talk about what we do got. Breathing depends on the skeletal muscles, right? So repetitive motions from the skeletal muscles. So we also know that muscles from these skeletal muscles are controlled by the brain and will cease if the spinal cord is severed. So this is very different from the heart. Um, Skeletal muscles also require nervous stimulation, right? The nerves, the brain have to control their contraction processes, right? And their relaxation. So, and we know that we need multiple respiratory muscles for the last video in order to coordinate even just taking a simple breath. So, and it's, partially because the lungs and all this stuff is relatively new on the evolutionary scale. So, maybe we've got some evolution yet to go, but for now, it's kind of a rickety system. It's not quite as well coordinated as, say, the digestive system and the heart. Those are old systems. Anyway, so breathing we do know is controlled at two levels of the brain. One is conscious, right? So that's cerebral, and the other one is unconscious and it's automatic. Okay. So the brainstem centers, so these are the automatic unconscious, oops, sorry, good there. Unconscious breathing is controlled by the respiratory centers and the reticular formation. So those are like the close to the brainstem, so medulla oblongata and the pons. Um, so two pairs of the respiratory system centers are in the medulla, and so we call these the ventral respiratory group. So this is like a rhythmic generator, right? So that's what that one's generally doing. And it kind of likes to stay around about 12 breaths per minute in the adult. Um, and for quiet breathing, like just, like low key breathing, the inspiratory neurons fire for about every 2 seconds, right? And then expiratory for every 3 seconds. So it's kind of like that's your cycle is about a 5 second, right? It's referred to as eupnea. The dorsal respiratory group modifies the rate and like how deep those breaths are going to be. Are they going to be big or are they going to be shallow? Right, like that. And so that one is going to be receiving influences from external sources, like generally oxygen demand from the body is going to be like a big one. Okay. So the brainstem respiratory centers. So there's one pair in the pons, and so this is the pontine, right, because of the pons. Um, Modifies the rhythm of the VRG and both of the outputs from ventral as well as the dorsal respiratory groups. They adapt breathing to circumstances such as like when you're sleeping, when you're running, if you're speaking, right? Because that can be really, have you ever, some of these, like, I gotta wonder, there's this guy named Kenny G, and apparently he has this technique called circular breathing, and he can hold these like musical notes on saxophones for like a long time, like world record long. So I'm wondering if that has to do with some of it, as well as like emotional responses such as like stress, for example. Okay. All right. Respiratory centers in the central nervous system, and this is just a diagram of it. So basically, here's what we're looking at. We're up here, right? Brainstem area, right? So these are all unconscious for the most part. So let's see here. What should we look at first? Oh, pons, right? Here's pontine center, respiratory group. Um, Ventral respiratory group is up here, dorsal. Also, so that's it. And like I said, if you have a break, if you have nerve damage, inflammation, and any of these nerves get severed or disrupted, and you lose functionality to these skeletal muscles, like you will also subsequently lose respiratory control. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. All right, central and peripheral input to the respiratory centers. Um, let's talk about some irregularities, such as hyperventilation. Oops, sorry. Get my pen. Okay, such as hyperventilation, meaning like you ventilating too much, right? Too much of it. Generally, we would consider this an anxiety, and there could be a lot of stresses that contribute to this, an anxiety triggered state. And the breathing is so rapid that it actually pushes out carbon dioxide faster than it's produced, and it causes like an imbalance, right? And so when you're pulling carbon dioxide out of the blood like too rapidly, what ends up happening is you have a pH that is going to rise, okay, and that's going to cause different things to happen, such as constriction of the cerebral arteries, lowering blood flow to the brain, and so that's going to cause like maybe dizziness, for example. Some people will even faint. And so generally what you can do is like when you see those pictures of people who are like huffing and puffing into a paper bag, yeah, doing that relatively early on, not exclusively, every once in a while, take a side breath. It just kind of keeps that carbon dioxide stable because it's like only allowing that exchange to happen that in that bag, right? So you're still going to be pulling in the same amount of CO2 and not any more oxygen for that exchange. So just, something to kind of keep in mind. The central and peripheral input to the respiratory centers are going to be partially chematoreceptors, right? So, sorry, chemoreceptors. Um, so chemoreceptors sense chemicals, right? So that's what they're doing, and they're looking specifically for those changes in pH. In this case, the cerebral spinal fluid, right? So the cerebral spinal fluid is very sensitive to the amount of CO2 in the blood, and so um, it kind of keeps its eye on it in that way. And so by just monitoring the cerebral spinal fluid using these chemoreceptors, we can tell if we are in a deficit for oxygen, if we have, basically what's happening, and controlling that blood pH, which can impact a lot of metabolic activities, not only in the body, but stabilizing these systems. So, peripheral chemoreceptors are going to be like in the carotid arteries and the aortic bodies, just generally. And so they're going to be responding to the oxygen levels and the CO2 content in the blood. Stretch receptors also. So, stretch receptors, they operate. So, if we have, everything's normal, say, this is like a normal width right here in the bronchial. So, when they sense that there is like it's like widened, right? When it's pulled out, for example, right? This would be um, it's responding to inflation of the lungs, right? So more air is coming through these like more stretched out um, bronchi and bronchioles. That's what that is referring to. And these stretch receptors are an inflation reflex, Herring-Brewer, and this is by excessive inflation. So it's like stretched for too long, right? So that's um, what that is. Okay, there it is. And now we have some other kinds. So these are irritant receptors. So nerve endings in the epithelial cells of the airway. And so this is going to be like environmental oftentimes. So people that react right away to things like smoke, dust, pollen, big time, some chemical fumes. Cold air for me, yeah. And in some cases also excess mucus. So this is going to be triggering some protective reflexes, such as making those bronchi like actually smaller, coming together smaller. So unfortunately, this limits breathing, making it shallower, or even resulting in not breathing temporarily, which is known as apnea or coughing. And this is like meant to be a temporary state, right? Like the irritant receptors are enacting, hoping that you're like running away from whatever it is that's causing these problems. Okay. The peripheral chemoceptors of reception, just wanted to kind of go over this one for O2, CO2. So here's the aortic, oops, sorry, bad. There, okay. Aortic bodies right here. So as you can see, these nerves are coming down, right? And they're attaching right into the aorta specifically. Also, they're going to attach a second place at the carotid artery, right? Carotid artery. known as the carotid body. And that's how they're sensing it. They're checking your CO2 levels. Right. Okay. Voluntary control of breathing. So voluntary control of breathing is something that is going to be originating in the motor cortex of your brain. Here, let me see if they have a picture of it. Nope, nope. I guess I'd have to get an old timey picture of the brain, or kind of just draw it. All right, so here's the brain. Right. And so remember we have like the sensory motor cortex, right? So this is where this is originating in the motor cortex of the frontal lobe. And so it's basically controlling voluntary muscles. And so that's what it is. And so there are limits to voluntary control. Um, so when CO2 levels rise, and so we have a higher acidity in the blood, we're going to have those automatic controls kind of jump back in, and that's going to override, right? So that's why, don't worry too much if your preschooler is threatening to hold their breath because they can't do it that long. All right. Okay. Pressure resistance and airflow. All right, let's get to that in a little bit. But for now, I wanted to just kind of like, get through control of breathing. And I hope that was helpful. And I hope you're out there having a wonderful day. Bye bye.